In the early medieval period, the Church did not initially treat witchcraft as a serious threat. Christian doctrine from the 5th to the 10th century often dismissed magical practices as illusions or foolish beliefs. Early church leaders, including figures like St. Augustine, believed that only God had true power and that demons or witches could not truly influence the world unless God allowed it. Those who claimed to fly at night or summon spirits were seen more as victims of delusion than as real dangers. However, this theological leniency did not erase popular belief. Among common folk, remnants of pre-Christian traditions persisted. Pagan customs and folklore were passed down through generations, especially in rural areas where priests had little influence. People still left offerings at sacred trees, hung protective charms in doorways, and turned to local healers, often women, for remedies and blessings. These healers were sometimes referred to as wise women or cunning folk, and while they provided valuable services, they also inspired unease. If a storm ruined a harvest, if a child fell ill without reason, if cows stopped giving milk, suspicion could quickly fall on those who were thought to possess unusual knowledge. By the 12th century, attitudes began to shift. European scholars and church leaders gradually developed the idea that witches were not simply misguided individuals, but heretics who had made pacts with the devil. This new theological framework linked magic not to ignorance, but to evil. The concept of diabolical witchcraft, that individuals could summon demons, cast harmful spells, or fly to secret gatherings to worship Satan, began to take hold. This idea did not originate purely from church doctrine, but grew from a mixture of religious teachings, ancient superstitions, and fears about social disorder. In a time when Europe was rocked by plagues, famines, and wars, people sought explanations for their suffering. The figure of the witch, now imagined as a servant of the devil, became a convenient scapegoat. Though large-scale witch hunts would not erupt until the later medieval and early modern periods, the groundwork was laid during these centuries. Theologians began to write detailed treatises on demons and their supposed interactions with humans. Confessions extracted under torture became accepted as proof of dark conspiracies. By the late 13th century, the Church had formalized its stance. Witchcraft was not only real, it was heresy, and it posed a spiritual threat to all of Christendom. This new perspective gave religious and secular authorities justification to act. In everyday life, these developments created an atmosphere of suspicion. A woman who lived alone, especially one without a husband or children, might be seen as dangerous. A midwife who lost a child during birth could be blamed for the death. A neighbor whose livestock thrived while others suffered might face accusations. The mere suggestion of witchcraft was enough to stain a person's reputation. Gossip could spread like wildfire, and fear did the rest. Yet even as belief in witches grew, actual prosecutions remained relatively rare throughout most of the medieval period. Local courts were often cautious, and many clergy still hesitated to fully endorse extreme claims. It wasn't until the late 15th century, with the publication of texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, that the witch craze would truly ignite. But the foundation was already in place. The merging of ancient fears with new religious ideology created a potent mix. The wise woman became the witch, the healer became the heretic, and fear, ancient, creeping, and relentless, was given a name. As the 14th century progressed, Europe found itself gripped by crisis after crisis. Famine, plague, and war tore through communities, leaving devastation in their wake. The Black Death alone wiped out nearly a third of the continent's population between 1347 and 1351. Entire villages vanished, and cities emptied as the sick died in the streets. In the face of such suffering, people searched for meaning, something or someone to blame. For many, the answer was witchcraft. The growing association between personal misfortune and malice led to a rise in accusations. Where once people might have accepted hardship as divine punishment or natural fate, now they suspected human agents working in secret. A failed harvest was no longer just bad luck. It might be the result of a curse. A sudden death was not just tragic. It might have been caused by someone calling upon the devil. This shift in thinking had devastating consequences for those who were vulnerable: the elderly, the poor, the socially isolated, and especially women. In medieval thought, women were often seen as morally weaker and more susceptible to temptation. Influential texts written by male clerics painted women as more emotional, more curious, and more prone to sin. This bias was not new. It had roots in classical antiquity and early Christian theology, but in times of crisis, it gained dangerous power. Women who deviated from social norms, who spoke too freely or lived alone, who practiced herbal medicine or acted as midwives, became easy targets. Their knowledge, once valued, was now suspect. One of the driving forces behind the formalization of witch hunting practices was the publication of theological and legal manuals that instructed authorities on how to identify and prosecute witches. These texts gathered earlier beliefs about heresy and blended them with vivid, often fantastical descriptions of demonic pacts, flying ointments, and nocturnal gatherings. Though not yet widespread, these ideas began to influence both religious courts and local officials. Slowly, suspicion turned into accusation, and accusation into trial. Trials for witchcraft in the 14th century remained localized and inconsistent. In some regions, judges were skeptical and reluctant to convict without strong evidence. In others, fear overcame reason. Under torture, accused individuals might confess to crimes they had never committed, harming children, poisoning wells, or summoning storms. These confessions, often coerced, were taken as proof not only of the accused's guilt, but of a larger network of evil. The belief that witches operated in covens, guided by the devil himself, began to spread. People no longer feared a single village healer. They feared an invisible conspiracy against Christendom. Despite these developments, the wider population remained deeply divided. In many villages, the accused were not strangers, but neighbors, relatives, or respected elders. Some communities resisted witch trials altogether, defending those who had long served as midwives or healers. Others embraced the fear, convinced that rooting out witches was a holy duty. The response depended on local culture, religious fervor, and the presence of charismatic preachers or inquisitors. As time went on, the church's position hardened. The Inquisition, originally created to combat heresy, began to focus more directly on alleged witches. Inquisitors were granted authority to investigate claims of sorcery and devil worship, often with brutal results. Although their methods varied by region, the use of torture was common, and the definition of guilt was broad. A dream, a birthmark, or a word spoken out of turn could be interpreted as evidence. Once accused, few escaped unscathed. At the same time, secular courts became more involved. In many cases, local lords or magistrates took it upon themselves to punish suspected witches, especially if they believed that spiritual corruption would bring disaster upon their lands. This cooperation between religious and civil authorities intensified the scope of persecution. What had once been a scattered fear was becoming an organized campaign. By the late 14th century, the figure of the witch had been fully transformed. No longer a misunderstood healer or wise woman, she was now imagined as a traitor to God, a seductress of demons, a destroyer of crops and families. This transformation was not accidental. It was shaped by centuries of theological debate, social anxiety, and political manipulation. Fear had become doctrine, and doctrine gave fear the tools it needed to act. By the beginning of the 15th century, the image of the witch had hardened into something far more sinister and defined than in earlier centuries. She was no longer just a local healer or a widow living at the edge of town. She had become, in the minds of both theologians and common people, a willing agent of the devil, a member of a secret and widespread conspiracy that sought to undermine the Christian world. This transformation was not just cultural or theological, it was political, legal, and profoundly gendered. Across much of Europe, church scholars and inquisitors began collecting accounts of alleged witches, compiling their confessions, often gained through torture, into handbooks and legal guides. These texts did more than record, they shaped belief. One of the most infamous among them was the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, written in 1487 by two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. Though not officially sanctioned by the church at first, the book quickly gained traction. It argued that witchcraft was real, dangerous, and overwhelmingly practiced by women. It provided instructions on how to detect, interrogate, and prosecute witches, and claimed that women were inherently more likely to become witches due to their supposed moral weakness and sexual corruption. The Malleus Maleficarum was not a medieval invention. It arrived at the end of the period, but its roots and ideas were deeply medieval, drawn from centuries of fear, theological tension, and social pressure. The book became one of the most influential texts in the history of witch persecution, and though its greatest impact would be felt in the early modern era, it reflected a mindset already firmly in place by the late Middle Ages. In many parts of Europe, especially the German-speaking lands, France, and northern Italy, witch trials began to increase in frequency and intensity during the late 15th century. Local rulers, eager to demonstrate piety or consolidate control, encouraged prosecutions. Traveling inquisitors moved from town to town, holding hearings and collecting accusations. Communities, already under strain from economic hardship, outbreaks of disease, and political instability, often welcomed these purges as a way to explain and resolve their suffering. The trials themselves were brutal. Torture was commonly used to extract confessions, and once one person was accused, others often followed. Under pressure, the accused would name neighbors, family members, or acquaintances as accomplices. A single accusation could spiral into a chain reaction, tearing apart entire villages. Evidence was scarce and rarely objective. A failed harvest, a sudden illness, or even a strange look could be enough to begin an investigation. If someone owned a cat, especially a black one, it might be called a familiar, a demon in animal form. If someone had a birthmark, it might be labeled the witch's teat, a place where demons were said to feed. The accused were overwhelmingly women, though not exclusively. Elderly widows were common targets, especially if they had no male relatives to defend them. Their age and isolation made them more vulnerable, and their knowledge of herbs or healing practices made them suspicious. But younger women, especially those who resisted traditional roles or were seen as sexually independent, were also at risk. In a deeply patriarchal society, witch trials became a means of enforcing conformity and punishing those who stepped outside expected boundaries. Still, belief in witchcraft and the intensity of prosecutions varied widely across regions. Some areas, like parts of England and Scandinavia, were slower to embrace large-scale hunts. Others, particularly regions of Central Europe, saw repeated waves of accusation and execution. The structure of local governance, the influence of the church, and the presence of charismatic religious figures often determined how quickly and how violently witch fears spread. Despite the horror of the trials, not all communities accepted them without question. There were judges who dismissed weak evidence, clergy who preached against superstition, and neighbors who defended the accused. In some cases, villagers resisted the arrival of inquisitors, fearing that their presence would bring more harm than good. These moments of resistance show that medieval Europe was not monolithic in its beliefs. Even in times of mass fear, some people held to reason, compassion, or simple doubt. But for those caught in the web of accusation, there was little hope. Trials could drag on for weeks or months. Some accused were burned at the stake, others hanged. Some were imprisoned for years, and many died during interrogation, never even reaching a formal verdict. The psychological toll on communities was immense. Trust between neighbors eroded. The line between reality and hysteria blurred. Fear became a daily presence, one that could turn without warning on anyone, no matter their innocence. By the close of the 15th century, witchcraft had become more than a belief. It had become an institution supported by law, theology, and social practice. And though the fires of persecution would burn brightest in the centuries to come, their embers had already been carefully laid in the long, uneasy shadow of the Middle Ages. As the 15th century gave way to the 16th, Europe stood on the edge of transformation. The Renaissance was beginning to stir in the south, while reform and rebellion brewed in the north. New ideas about science, politics, and religion were emerging, challenging the rigid structures of the medieval world. But despite this intellectual awakening, or perhaps because of the uncertainty it created, fear of witchcraft intensified. The late medieval foundations of suspicion and superstition became the scaffolding for a terrifying new era of mass persecution. At the heart of this growing panic was the belief that witches were no longer isolated individuals, but members of a vast and organized conspiracy. The church had long warned of demonic influence, but now secular authorities also viewed witches as enemies of the state. Witchcraft was no longer seen merely as heresy. It was treason against both God and crown. This dual threat meant that efforts to root out witches became more aggressive, more systematic, and far more deadly. One of the most notable changes was the increasing involvement of secular courts. While ecclesiastical authorities had long taken the lead in prosecuting heresy, the growing secular power of kings and local magistrates led to new legal codes that specifically targeted witchcraft. These laws allowed for harsh punishments, encouraged public denunciation, and sanctioned the use of torture to extract confessions. In places like the Holy Roman Empire, entire territories were swept up in witch-hunting frenzies, with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people tried and executed in the span of a few years. The rise of print culture played a crucial role in spreading and reinforcing fear. Pamphlets and broadsheets describing alleged witches and their crimes were circulated widely. These accounts were often exaggerated, filled with lurid details of demonic rituals, pacts sealed in blood, and cannibalistic feasts. Though fictionalized, they were accepted by many as truth, especially in rural communities where literacy was low and fear was high. These stories shaped the public imagination, turning witchcraft into a monstrous threat that demanded urgent action. In this climate, the legacy of medieval suspicion evolved into a tool of political control. Leaders who faced unrest or uncertainty could direct attention toward witchcraft as a common enemy. In some cases, rulers used witch trials to assert moral authority, portraying themselves as defenders of divine order. In others, accusations were used strategically to silence opponents or to justify the elimination of undesirable elements in society. Women, once again, bore the brunt of this violence. Though men were sometimes accused, the overwhelming majority of victims were female. The old medieval stereotypes of women as spiritually weak and morally suspect persisted, now intensified by fear and official doctrine. Social dynamics also played a role. In many communities, personal grievances were disguised as moral crusades. Disputes over land, inheritance, or reputation could easily turn into accusations of witchcraft. A neighbor who refused to lend grain, a relative who contested a will, or a woman who rejected a marriage proposal might all become targets. The mechanisms of accusation were deeply personal, yet once the process began, it was no longer private. Trials were often public spectacles, with entire communities watching as former friends and family were interrogated, tortured, and condemned. At the same time, there were those who resisted. Some clergy spoke out against the cruelty of the trials, arguing that they did more harm than good. A few jurists questioned the reliability of confessions obtained under torture, and in certain regions, especially in parts of the Netherlands and England, skepticism began to grow. Not every accusation led to a conviction. Not every judge accepted the popular hysteria. The medieval world had always contained conflicting voices, those of faith, fear, reason, and doubt, and those voices continued to wrestle for dominance as the early modern era approached. But in many places, the machinery of persecution was well-oiled and relentless. Children were encouraged to denounce parents. Husbands testified against wives. Torture devices, refined over centuries, were used to break bodies and wills. Those who confessed were sometimes spared death, but faced lifelong shame and exile. Those who denied the charges were often deemed even more dangerous, their resistance seen as proof of Satan's power. The choice between confession and silence was for many no choice at all. The fires that consumed accused witches in public squares were not merely tools of punishment, they were symbols of control. They reminded the watching crowds that deviating from the norm, stepping outside prescribed roles, or challenging authority came at the highest price. In this way, the medieval fear of witches became a self-perpetuating force, used not only to target the suspected, but to discipline society as a whole. As the 16th century unfolded, the echoes of the Middle Ages remained ever present. The theological arguments, the legal frameworks, the gendered suspicions, they all originated in medieval thought and belief. And while the scale of witch persecution would reach its peak in the early modern period, its roots ran deep into the centuries that came before. The story of witchcraft in the Middle Ages was not simply about ignorance or fear. It was also about power, who had it, who was threatened by it, and how far they were willing to go to protect it. And for those who lived in the shadow of that fear, there was no safety in innocence, no comfort in tradition, and often no escape at all. By the time the 17th century arrived, Europe was no longer the world it had been in the depths of the Middle Ages. The printing press had revolutionized the spread of information. The Protestant Reformation had shattered the religious unity of the continent. Scientific discoveries were beginning to challenge ancient assumptions about the universe, the human body, and even the soul. Yet in the midst of this intellectual and cultural upheaval, the long medieval shadow of witchcraft continued to fall over entire communities. The persecution of witches did not suddenly vanish with the dawn of modernity. On the contrary, in some areas it intensified. The foundations laid in the medieval period, the theological definitions, the legal structures, the gendered fears, continued to inform and legitimize a system of terror. By now, the figure of the witch was deeply familiar, shaped not only by centuries of belief, but also by generations of storytelling, trial records, and state propaganda. She was seen as the enemy within, the internal traitor who disrupted the social order from inside the village, the family, even the church. Witchcraft had become a way to name and confront what society could not control: failed crops, sudden illness, social deviance, female independence, or unexplained misfortune. And though rational voices were beginning to emerge, voices calling for evidence, for fairness, for mercy, they were often drowned out by the momentum of fear. What made this continuation particularly tragic was the way it turned ordinary people into instruments of accusation. Medieval suspicion had always relied on rumor and local knowledge, but in the early modern period, that suspicion was increasingly formalized. Community members were expected to report strange behavior. Confessions extracted under duress were considered valid evidence. The word of a child, especially in places like Würzburg or Salem, could condemn dozens. Trials were no longer isolated responses to individual fears. They became coordinated efforts, driven by both popular panic and institutional authority. Still, the seeds of change had been planted. Over time, doubts about the legitimacy of witch trials began to grow. Some judges refused to use torture, citing its unreliability. Physicians and scholars began to study mental illness and natural causes of disease, offering explanations that did not rely on demons or spells. And as printing continued to expand access to knowledge, critiques of the witch hunts reached a broader audience. Thinkers like Reginald Scott in England and later Johann Weyer in Germany argued publicly against the persecution of witches, calling it not only unjust, but unchristian. This slow, uneven process of reevaluation eventually led to a decline in trials and executions. By the early 18th century, the great witch hunts of Europe had largely come to an end. Laws were revised or repealed, courts became more cautious, skepticism, once a rare and dangerous position, became more common. But for the thousands who had died, burned, hanged, tortured, drowned, this change came too late. And yet, the legacy of the medieval fear of witchcraft did not vanish. It lingered in culture, in literature, and in memory. The image of the witch remained a powerful symbol of rebellion, of mystery, of fear. In some ways, that image became even more potent in the centuries that followed. Witches appeared in plays, novels, and eventually in film and television, reimagined again and again, sometimes as villains, sometimes as misunderstood women, sometimes as icons of strength. But to understand that symbol fully, one must return to the Middle Ages, to the fields and forests, the churches and courts, where fear was given a name and a target. Witchcraft in the medieval world was not about magic alone. It was about the fear of change, the fear of difference, and the desperate need to explain what could not be controlled. It was about power, who had it, who wanted it, and who was willing to destroy others to keep it. The Middle Ages did not invent witches, but they gave them a place in law, in religion, and in public imagination. And though time moved forward, the structures built during those centuries would guide and shape centuries of violence. The fires lit in village squares may have burned out, but the echoes of their flames can still be heard in history books, in folklore, and in the questions we ask about justice, belief, and fear. In the end, the story of witchcraft in the Middle Ages is not just about the women and men who were accused. It is about the society that accused them, a society struggling with uncertainty, desperate for order, and willing to sacrifice its own to preserve a fragile sense of control. And in remembering that past, we are reminded of how easily fear can become truth, and how carefully truth must be defended, even in the darkest of times.